Welcome to MSPTDA video number 8. Hey, we're still talking about Power Query. And in this video, we got to talk about the amazing Group By feature. Now, this video will go over the basics of what Group By is and what it does. And then later throughout this class, when we're making data model transformations, we'll use Group By in all sorts of amazing ways. Now, what does Group By do? Well, this is a picture of the Group By button in Power Query. And what it means is we have a full data set. And when we specify some condition or criteria, we get a subset of records. Then, with that subset of records, we can do anything we want. Calculations, transformations, and all sorts of amazing things. So in this video, we'll see how to do Group By to calculate total sales, standard deviation, join a bunch of names together, rank sales, which is hard to do in Power Query, but Group By makes it easy. And we'll, of course, see how to group by 2 or more columns. Now let's talk about what Group By is. Group By does two simple things. It will take a column and extract a unique list of items. And then, based on that unique list of items, we can say, hey, look at the sales column and make aggregate calculations like total sales or standard deviation. And we can tell it to look at a sales rep column filled with names and do something like join all the names together. Now, why Group By? Well, if you're familiar with SQL and databasing, or even pivot tables, you already know what Group By does is it, yes, goes through this column and extracts a unique list. But when it gets to the aggregating part, it actually finds all of the records, for example, for Bellin, and returns a small table. That means for Bellin, it groups together all of the records for that particular condition or criteria. We're grouping all the records for Bellin, Carlota, Quad, Sunshine, and then making some aggregate calculation, whether number aggregation or a text aggregation. Now, to illustrate the concept of Group By, we're going to build a standard pivot table. I click in a single cell, go up to Insert, Pivot Table, or we use our keyboard, Alt-N-V. We're going to put it on the existing worksheet, cell G6, click OK. From our field list, watch this, I'm dragging product down to rows. Right there, from our knowledge of creating pivot tables, when we drag something down to rows, we get a unique list. That's step 1 of Group By. Then in a pivot table, when we drag sales down to values, that's step 2 of Group By. So why do we do a pivot table here? Just to prove that we already know the concepts. Get a unique list, make some aggregate calculation. Now, if you really just had a table and this is all you wanted to do, we almost certainly wouldn't use Power Query. We'd just use a standard pivot table. However, throughout this class, we will use Power Query and Group By often. Now, this is one perfect parallel that proves that we already know the concepts of Group By. If over on this sheet, we were using the SUMIFS function. Now, this is a formula, right? But it's doing the same thing. We have a unique list here, and we're making an aggregate calculation. Now, when we get over to our final report in Power Query, we're actually going to do 3 columns, total sales, standard deviation, and a list of who sold this product. Now, I'm going to put this formula in edit mode, F2. That is an insane array formula. So with Power Query, we don't have to create something crazy like this. We'll use the Group By feature to make our calculation much easier. Now, over on the sheet Group By DAX, we will later in the class see how to create Group By calculations, total sales, standard deviation, and joining all the employees' names using DAX formulas. But that's for later in this class. By the way, our standard pivot table we just looked at It's not going to make this calculation, but Power Query and DAX can. Also, if you know SQL, that is the simple SQL code to group by. There's the unique list, and this is from a different table than our example. And there's the aggregate calculation. So it doesn't matter if you're doing group by in SQL, a pivot table, SUMIFS, or DAX. When we go over to the sheet Power Query Group By, yes, we're going to use Power Query. And so some of the steps will be different, but the concept is the same. Unique list, aggregate calculation. All right, now we want to bring this table into Power Query. So Data Ribbon tab, Get and Transform, and From Table button. Now we're going to use our keyboard. We've been using Alt-APT. That opens up the Power Query editor. We want to come over and rename this. That's the name of the Excel table. We want to give this query a new name, something like Group By Product Report, and Enter. Come down, and we do not need change type, so I'm going to use the red X to get rid of it. Now, our goal is to group by product and add the sales, calculate the standard deviation. So to group by, you select the column. This is the column we want to extract the unique list from. And there's 3 places to get group by. Home, Transform, there's group by. It's the very first button when you go to the Transform Ribbon tab, or we can right-click Group By. Now, wait a second. I thought I said I wanted a unique list and then aggregate on this column. Shouldn't I delete these 2 columns first? No, when we group by and say, hey, I want to group by this column and aggregate by this column, it'll automatically remove the other columns not involved in the group by. So right-click, Group By. The Group By dialog box, if we have one column selected, has the basic option selected. If we wanted to group by more than one column, which we'll do later in the video, or we wanted to have multiple aggregations, then we would select Advanced. There's Product. We will get the unique list from that column. This is where we create our aggregation. I'm going to select Count. This is the name of the column, and type Total Sales. Tab. Now look at this. Here's the drop down. I see aggregate functions like sum, average, median, min, max, count rows, and distinct. You know what? I do not see standard deviation. Now this is different than, for example, over in Excel, pivot table, subtotal, and other features where we always have 11 aggregate functions. So if we want to do something like standard deviation, we're going to have to do something different than select it from this list. But no problem. We're going to say sum. That's our first calculation. The column that the sum function is going to work on is sales. Now let's just click OK and see what we get. And there's a basic group by, our unique list and our aggregated numbers. Over here, we can see a step group by. If we come up to the formula bar, we can see the Table.Group Function. There's the previous step. Power Query functions always work on the previous step. Then that's the name of the column where we're getting our unique list, comma, and then the third argument, a list within a list. And we only have one aggregation, so there's only one list within this list. Lists are always in curly bracket syntax. But there it is, the 3 elements for this new column. There's the name, comma. And each means for each row in the unique list, make this calculation. There's our function, List.Sum. Now, 2 things about List.Sum and then in square brackets sales. List.Sum, that's just one of many aggregate functions. There's List.Sum, min, max, and even standard deviation. Now, the square bracket sales, because it's sitting in Table.Group, it's not going to add all of the sales from the original table. If we look down here, for each row, it's only looking at the sales for the quad product. And then Carlota, Bellin, and Sunshine, comma. And then the third argument is the data type. Now, we'll come back and look at this function more. But for the time being, I want to come over to Group Rows and double-click it to edit. In the Group By dialog box, I want to select Advanced. Come down to Add Aggregation. And this perhaps is the real power of Group By. Yes, we have these aggregate functions. But down here, All Rows. When I select All Rows, that means for each row, Quad, Carlota, Bellin, and Sunshine, all rows will gather up all of the matching records or the grouped records. That means for the quad row, when we return this column here, it will return a table with all of the quad records. For Carlota, all rows says, please return a small table with all the Carlota records. The advantage to this, of course, is once we have all the records, we can do any type of calculation we might want. I'm going to call this all rows. And now when we click OK, yes, we have our aggregated column. But now when I click off to the side for quad, there's all the related records. If I want to do standard deviation on this column, I can. If I want to do something with the dates, no problem. Or like for our example, we're going to eventually have to extract a unique list of sales rep and join them all in a single cell. When I come down to the Carlota row, there's all the matching records returned in a table for Carlota. Now we can add however many columns we want. Now our first calculation is going to be standard deviation. And I'm actually going to show you 3 different ways to calculate standard deviation. In this report, we'll see 2 ways. And then in the last report we do, I'll show you the final way. For our first example of standard deviation, we'll go up to Add Column, Custom Column. In the Custom Column dialog box, we'll call this column Standard Deviation S for sample. Now we're going to use List.StandardDeviation, open parentheses. And now, because this is a custom column, we cannot link up in List.Sum, just use the sales column. That sales column in List.Sum works because it's in Table.Group. List.StandardDeviation needs to first access the all rows table for each row in our report. So we come over and we select the all rows column. That means List.StandardDeviation, as the formula is copied down, we'll look at this column. Well, as we can see down here, that's a full table. And we want to access only sales. So now we use our lookup operator to look up a column and put sales. And sales will properly look at that entire column and calculate standard deviation. Now we can close parentheses and click OK. And there we have used Group By to get the rows and then added an extra column for standard deviation. Now I would like to round this, so I can either come over and double-click to open this up, or I can look up to the formula bar. There's our Table.Add column, grouped rows. That, of course, is the previous step. There's the name of the column for each row down here. There's our calculation. So I can simply come up before list, and the function for rounding is number.round, open parentheses. Now I come to the end, comma, and I want to round it to the penny, so 2, close parentheses, and enter. And there's our new column with the result. There's the calculation. There's the extra step. Now we want to add another column, because if we go look at our table, let's actually go look at Carlota. What I would like listed for each row is a unique list of sales reps. So no problem. I can do that because I have matched records in the sales rep column. So up to Add Column, Custom Column. We'll name this column Who Sold Product. Now, for our formula, the first trick is we want a unique list. And just like we had aggregate functions for numbers, we can use List.Distinct, open parentheses. And we have to do the same thing. I'm going to get the full table and then look up the column. So that'll be sales rep, close square bracket, close parentheses. Now, I just want to see what this delivers. And as you can imagine, it's actually going to deliver a list. So when I click OK, there is a list object in each one of the cells. If I go down to Carlota, there's our unique list. Going back to the original table, there were lots of duplicates. But with List.Distinct, there we go. Now, I wish we had that function in Excel because, as you remember, there was a crazy array formula we had to do to get a distinct or unique list. Now, I could edit this column, or I could come up to the formula bar, and we want to combine everything. And actually, earlier in the class, we saw this function, Text.Combine, open parentheses. Now, I come to the end after List.Distinct, comma. And the second argument in Text.Combine is the delimiter. So double quotes, comma, space, and double quotes, close parentheses. And now when I hit Enter, that is amazing. Now I want to go back to grouped rows and look at what Table.Group Function did. Remember, it's a list within a list. We have two aggregate calculations. We did List.Sum, and then look at this. Each, and that underscore means get everything in the row. So what did it do? It actually returned the entire grouped set of records. But the point is, we can actually, once we invoke Table.Group, we can put all of our aggregate calculations in one function. That means if we were to take the two formulas down in these custom columns and simply place them up here as a list within a list, we wouldn't have to group rows, and we wouldn't have to create these extra columns. Now, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to come down to Custom Column, the first one, and double-click, and simply copy the formula. Control-C. One difference, though, is that when we put this inside of Table.Group, we are definitely not going to need the table from all rows. We're simply going to need the sales column. Cancel. Now I come up to Group Rows. I'm going to type this right up in the formula bar. List within a list. So that last curly bracket is the first list. And since there's lists within a list, I type a comma, curly bracket. The name of this column is going to be Standard Deviation S in double quotes, comma, space. And then the word each will allow us to make a calculation for each row. Space. And I'm going to Control V. Very carefully, I'm going to come. And remember, we only needed all rows because we were in a separate column. Once we are inside of Table.Group, sales field will suffice. That sales field will access only the matched records. Now, I'm still in the middle of my third list within a list. That's the second item in the list, the actual calculation. So now I have to type comma, and then whatever the type is, type. And I'm going to put number. That'll be decimal. Now close curly bracket. And when I hit Enter, look at that. Now we will get rid of all rows in just a second. But let's come over to Add Columns. There's that formula I'm going to use. Control-C, cancel. Come back up to Group Rows. And now right after the third item in the list, comma, space, curly bracket. And then the name of this column, who sold product. And then down here, comma. And the second item in the list is the calculation. So we put each, space, Control-V. Very carefully get rid of. Now notice we're pasting these because we already created them. But by all means, we could have typed this out just like we typed it out in the custom column. All right, now we're being careful. That's the second item in the list. So after the last parentheses for Text.Combine, comma, and this is going to be type text, close curly brackets. Now when I hit Enter, that is so cool. We do not need this column, so we can come up and remove it. Select all of that, including the comma, and delete. Enter. And look at that. It went away. Now these columns are unnecessary. We can delete them. But let's just make a point here. You can do one group rows and type out your extra columns, or no problem, do the rows and add your custom columns. The reason we have the user interface is sometimes it's easier to do it that way. But we wanted to make sure to see that we are allowed to do it all in one Table.Group, or add the rows and add extra columns. Now let's X these out. I'm going to X this one out. We are going to need one last step because Table.Group allowed us to add data types. But this one is the original column, so I'm going to click the data type icon down to text. There it is, 1, 2, 3 steps. Now I can home, close and load to. Table is fine. Existing sheet. Let's try G4, click OK. And there's our report. There's our query. I am glad that we have Power Query to do. Please get a unique list of sales rep for each product. Now we have 2 more reports we want to do that'll illustrate important group by concepts and features. Now the next one is ranking in Power Query. Now in Excel and DAX, there are built-in functions to rank, but not in Power Query. Well, luckily, group by will come to our rescue when we want to rank. Now I'm going to click in a single cell, Alt-APT. We'll name our query something like rank product sales and enter. I'm going to X out change type. And the trick we're going to learn with group by to rank would work on all of these numbers also. But I'm actually going to first group by product and sales and get those numbers, and then we'll rank the grouped sales. Right click down to group by. The new column name, total sales. Sum, and we'll sum on the sales column and enter. Step 1 to rank is to sort the numbers. We're going to sort them descending, biggest on top. Now we go up to add columns. Add an index column. Click the drop-down. Power Query is base 0, but we can certainly start from 1. And there's our rank. Now, if you're not worried about ties, getting different numbers, you're done. You simply go to Home and Load. But if you want your rank to be 1, 2, 2, 4, that's where group by comes in. Because guess what? We have ties. If I group these together, they'll show up as a single number. And if we do all rows as our grouping, we'll get 2 and 3. And then we can do a min calculation. And it will pick out the 2 for both rows. So let's try this. Right-click, Group By. It's grouping by the total sales column. Now we want to say all rows, and I'm going to select all rows. Click OK or Enter. Now if we look at our second record, now we can add a column to calculate the min. And when we later come back and expand this column, we will get back our Sunshine Quad and our 2 sales. So add column, custom column. We're going to call this rank. And our formula will be List.Min, open parentheses. Now we have our all rows, square bracket, index, close square bracket, close parentheses. Now this should already give you an idea. We actually could have done this step up when we did our grouping for all rows. But now when I click OK, there it is. If I come up now and expand, uncheck use original, uncheck everything, we want product, and that's all we want. Click OK. And there's our rank. Now let's back up a second here. I'm going to X out, double click group rows, because guess what? We could have, even though we needed all rows to expand later, we could have done our min calculation right here. Let's click Advance, Add Aggregation. This will be Rank, Tab. We'll get our min tab, and we're going to use the index column. Now when I click OK, from that single group rows, we have the column we need to expand, and we have the wrong column. No problem. I'm going to go back up here. By the way, that should give you the hint that the min and max functions in Power Query are alphanumeric. I actually already have some videos about that at YouTube. What we wanted was index. Click OK. I love that. How easy is it to just go back and edit? Now we can expand, uncheck everything, and all we need is product. When I click product, it will properly repeat that 2 and that number. Click OK, and now we have what we want. 2 tied numbers, the product name, and they're both ranked number 2. Now I'm going to rearrange the columns. Click and drag. How easy is that in Power Query? We need a data type, so we'll add text. We have our report. We have our steps. Now we can go to Home, Close and Load to Table, Existing. We'll put this in G13. Click OK. There's our report. Now the last example for Group By is now we want to see sales and standard deviation for product and sales rep. And we'll see our third example of how to calculate standard deviation. I'm going to click in a single cell, Alt-APT. We'll name this query something like product and sales rep report, and enter. I'm going to X out, change type. Now we select product, hold shift, select sales rep. And when we right click group, it'll automatically switch us to advanced. It knows that we want 2 columns. This will give us a unique list of combinations. And we're going to create our first calculation, total sales. We'll use sum function, and the column is going to be sales. But here's our trick for standard deviation. If it's just a straight aggregate calculation, guess what? I'm going to calculate it right here. Well, wait a second. Standard deviation isn't here, but here's where we're going to use a placeholder function. For the time being, I'm going to do sum. Click sales as our column to make the calculation on. Click OK. Now I simply come up to the formula bar, click the expand button. And for the second sum calculation, double click sum. And we're going to type standard deviation and enter. That is amazing. And of course, it was amazing. We have 2 columns. So now we have calculations for 2 different conditions or criteria. Now, all the zeros here are because most of these sales were for single amounts. Later, we'll add new data and see that everything will update. I'm going to add a new data type to 2 columns at once. So I click on the first column, hold shift, click on the second column, right click, change type, and down to text. Now, probably for 2 columns, it was still faster to do it 2 at a time. But if you have a bunch of columns and they all are getting the same data type, that's a good way to do it. There's our steps. Close and load to table, existing, G21, click OK. Now we have our report. 2 conditions or criteria grouped by with 2 different aggregate calculations. There's our query. Now let's scroll over to the side here. This is some new data I'd like to add. I'm going to click in the top cell, Control asterisk on the number pad to highlight the current table, Control C to copy, Control Home to jump to cell A1. I'm going to click in B5, and when I Control V, instantly this table object has a bunch of new records. Now I'd like to update the reports and the queries all at once. So I could go to Data, Refresh All, or I could use the keyboard, Control-Alt-F5. And look at that. Report number 1, 2, and 3 all have updated with our new data. Now, that was a lot of fun with the Group By feature. In our third report, we saw how to use 2 columns to make aggregate calculations with 2 conditions or criteria. We also saw how to use a placeholder function here in the Group By dialog box. That makes it easy when you're doing aggregate calculations that are not in our dropdown. We also saw how to use Group By to rank. And we started it off by learning the basics of group by, getting a unique list, and making aggregate calculations on either number columns or text columns. Now, if you like that video, be sure to click that thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe, because there's always lots more videos to come from Excelisfun, including our next video, video number 9. We'll talk more about the M code language behind the scenes in Power Query. All right, we'll see you next video.